The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor as Margaret stepped into the grand ballroom. Her blue silk dress rustled softly with each movement, and she couldn't help but smile at the sight before her. The Goldwyn Academy's annual fundraising gala was in full swing, and it looked like something straight out of a fairy tale. Tonight was special for many reasons, but Margaret had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. The Academy meant everything to her family. Her father had donated generously over the years, and she had spent countless hours volunteering in their library. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air that she couldn't quite put her finger on. "Margaret, darling, you look absolutely stunning," called out Mrs. Patterson, the Academy's director. She was a kind woman in her 60s who had dedicated her life to education. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Margaret replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "The ballroom looks incredible. You've really outdone yourself this year." Mrs. Patterson beamed with pride. "Well, we're hoping to raise enough money tonight to renovate the East Wing. The students deserve the very best facilities we can provide." As they chatted, Margaret's eyes wandered around the room. The cream-colored walls were adorned with oil paintings of the Academy's founders, and fresh white roses filled every corner, with their sweet fragrance. Well-dressed couples moved gracefully across the dance floor, their laughter mixing with the gentle hum of conversation. But something was missing, something that usually made these evenings even more magical. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said, "what happened to the piano music? Usually we have someone playing during dinner." The older woman's face fell slightly. "Oh, that's our one disappointment this evening. You remember Mr. Chen, our wonderful pianist? He moved to California last month to be closer to his grandchildren. We haven't been able to find anyone else who can do justice to our beautiful Steinway." Margaret followed Mrs. Patterson's gaze to the far corner of the ballroom, where a magnificent black grand piano sat silent. It was truly a work of art. Its polished surface reflected the chandelier light like a dark mirror. Even from across the room, she could see the care that had gone into maintaining it. "What a shame," Margaret said. "That piano has such a beautiful sound. Remember last year when Mr. Chen played that Chopin piece, there wasn't a dry eye in the house." "Indeed," Mrs. Patterson sighed. "We've advertised in all the local papers, but finding someone with both the skill and the time has proven more difficult than we expected." As if on cue, Margaret's friend Helen appeared at her side, slightly out of breath from dancing. "What are you two looking so serious about?" she asked, smoothing down her red hair. "We were just discussing the piano situation," Margaret explained. "It's such a beautiful instrument, but no one here tonight can play it." Helen glanced around the room at the assembled guests. Surely someone among all these accomplished people must know how to play. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "You'd be surprised. We asked several people earlier this evening, but everyone either doesn't play or feels too nervous to perform in front of such a crowd." "Well, that's just ridiculous," Helen declared with a laugh. "If I could play piano, I'd be over there right now showing off. Some people have no sense of adventure." Margaret giggled at her friend's boldness. Helen had always been the more daring of the two, never afraid to speak her mind or try something new. It was one of the things Margaret admired most about her. "Easy for you to say," Margaret teased. "You don't have to worry about embarrassing yourself in front of half the city's social elite." "Oh, please," Helen waved her hand dramatically. "These people would probably love any entertainment at this point. Look at them. They're practically falling asleep in their soup." Margaret had to admit her friend had a point. The evening, while elegant, was lacking the spark that live music usually provided. The conversation seemed more subdued, and even the dancing had slowed down considerably. "You know what?" Margaret said, feeling a playful mood come over her. "If someone, anyone, could sit down at that piano right now and play something beautiful, something that would bring this room to life, I'd be so impressed that I'd probably marry them on the spot." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and both Helen and Mrs. Patterson burst into laughter. "Margaret Sinclair, did you just propose to an imaginary pianist?" Helen gasped between giggles. "I suppose I did." Margaret laughed, feeling her cheeks grow warm. "But honestly, wouldn't it be wonderful? Someone mysterious and talented appearing out of nowhere to save the evening? Mrs. Patterson was still chuckling. My dear, you've been reading too many romance novels. This is real life, not a storybook. I know, Margaret said, taking another sip of her champagne. But a girl can dream, can't she? Besides, it would take someone truly special to make that piano sing the way it deserves to. Their conversation was interrupted by the dinner bell, and the three women made their way to their assigned table. Margaret found herself seated between her father, a distinguished gentleman with graying temples, and Dr. Williams, a prominent physician who had supported the academy for years. During dinner, the conversation flowed easily between discussions of the academy's future plans, the latest books everyone was reading, and the upcoming city council elections. Margaret participated enthusiastically, but her eyes kept drifting back to the silent piano. She wondered what it would sound like in this acoustically perfect room. The ballroom had been designed with music in mind. The high ceilings and careful placement of windows created natural resonance that made even spoken conversation carry beautifully. As dessert was being served, Mrs. Patterson stood up to address the crowd. She thanked everyone for their generous donations and spoke passionately about the Academy's mission to provide quality education for all students, regardless of their family's financial situation. Before we conclude this lovely evening, Mrs. Patterson said, I'd like to make one final request. As many of you have noticed, our beautiful piano has remained silent tonight. If there's anyone here who would be willing to share their musical talents with us, we would be deeply grateful. The room fell quiet as people looked around at each other. A few gentlemen shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Margaret heard someone whisper, I only know chopsticks. After a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, Mrs. Patterson smiled graciously. Well, perhaps another time. Thank you all again for making this evening such a success. As the evening wound down and guests began to gather their coats, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something magical had been just within reach. She said her goodbyes and thanked Mrs. Patterson for a wonderful evening, but part of her felt disappointed. Walking to her father's car, she paused and looked back at the academy's lit windows. Somewhere in that building was a piano waiting for the right person to bring it to life. She had spoken in jest about marrying whoever could play it, but deep down, she meant something real. She wanted to find someone who could see the beauty in things others overlooked, someone who wasn't afraid to step forward when others stepped back. Little did she know, her words had not gone unheard. Thomas Wheeler pushed his cleaning cart through the service corridor, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished floor. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the walls from the ballroom where the gala was still in full swing. He had been working at Goldwyn Academy for 3 years now, and these fancy events had become routine for him. Most people didn't notice the night janitor. He was like a shadow moving through the building after hours, making sure everything was spotless for the next day. Thomas preferred it that way. He could do his work in peace, listening to the distant sounds of life happening around him without having to be part of it. Tonight felt different, though. The music that usually filled these events was missing, and he could sense the disappointment even from the hallways. Thomas knew about the piano situation. Mr. Chen had been kind to him, sometimes staying late to practice when Thomas was cleaning. They would nod to each other politely, and occasionally Mr. Chen would play something soft and beautiful while Thomas worked nearby. Thomas missed those moments more than he cared to admit. He made his way to the supply closet near the ballroom's service entrance. From here, he could hear the conversations more clearly. Mrs. Patterson was asking again if anyone could play the piano. The silence that followed made his chest tighten with a familiar ache. As he organized his cleaning supplies, a woman's voice caught his attention. It was clear and confident, with a hint of playfulness that made him pause in his work. If anyone could sit down at that piano right now and play something beautiful, something that would bring this room to life, I'd be so impressed that I'd probably marry them on the spot. The words were followed by laughter, but something in her tone told Thomas she wasn't entirely joking. There was a longing there, a genuine appreciation for music that he recognized. He found himself moving closer to the service door, curious about the woman who had spoken. Through the small window in the door, he could see the speaker clearly now. She was young, probably around his age, with dark hair elegantly pinned up and wearing a blue dress that seemed to shimmer under the chandeliers. But it wasn't her beauty that caught his attention. It was the way she kept glancing at the piano with such wistful eyes. Thomas knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection countless times. He pulled back from the window and leaned against the wall, his heart beating faster than usual. The woman's words echoed in his mind. She had spoken about marrying someone who could make that piano sing, and while he knew she was joking, something about her sincerity struck deep. Thomas had secrets. Secrets he had kept buried for years, hidden beneath work uniforms and calloused hands. The truth was, he could play that piano. He could make it sing in ways that would surprise everyone in that ballroom. But that was a life he had left behind, a dream he had been forced to abandon. He continued his work mechanically, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces, but his mind was elsewhere. As a child, music had been everything to him. His mother had scraped together enough money for piano lessons when he was 8, recognizing a gift in her son that she couldn't afford to ignore. By the time he was 16, Thomas was good enough to audition for the state conservatory. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been so excited about his potential. She believed he could have a real future in music, maybe even perform with symphony orchestras someday. But life had other plans. His father died in a factory accident when Thomas was 17, leaving behind debts that swallowed up any dreams the family might have had. Thomas took a job at a warehouse to help support his mother and younger sister. The conservatory scholarship had to be declined. The piano lessons stopped. Music became a luxury he couldn't afford. His mother had died 2 years ago, and his sister had married and moved to another state. Thomas was alone now, working nights and living in a small apartment across town. But sometimes late at night when the academy was empty, he would sit at that piano and remember who he used to be. The first time had been an accident. He was cleaning the ballroom after a school concert, and his hands had simply found their way to the keys. The muscle memory was still there, waiting patiently after all these years. The piano had welcomed him back like an old friend. Since then, he had played occasionally during his night shifts, never for long and never loud enough for the security guard to hear from his office downstairs. It was his secret, his small rebellion against the life that circumstances had forced upon him. Thomas finished cleaning the main hallway and moved toward the ballroom. The dinner portion of the evening was winding down, and he could hear Mrs. Patterson making her closing remarks. Soon the guests would leave and he would have the space to himself. As he waited in the service corridor, he thought about the woman in the blue dress. What would she think if she knew that the answer to her playful wish was mopping floors just a few feet away? Would she laugh? Would she be embarrassed? Would she even believe him? The thought of revealing himself terrified Thomas. These people lived in a different world from his. They wore expensive clothes and talked about things he could only dream. Of what right did he have to intrude on their evening, to claim he belonged among them even for a moment? But her words kept coming back to him. The way she had looked at that piano with such longing, the genuine sadness in her voice when she talked about how beautiful it would sound. She understood something that many people missed, that music wasn't just entertainment, it was connection, emotion, life itself. The ballroom doors opened and guests began filing out. Thomas retreated deeper into the shadows, watching as they gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. The woman in blue walked past his hiding spot, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of spring mornings. She paused near the main entrance, looking back toward the ballroom with that same wistful expression. Her companion, a woman with red hair, was saying something about the evening being lovely despite the lack of music. "Such a shame," the woman in blue replied. "That piano has so much potential. It just needs the right person to bring it to life." Thomas pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath until they passed. When the last guest had left and Mrs. Patterson had locked up the main entrances, the building fell into familiar silence. The security guard would make his rounds, in an hour, giving Thomas plenty of time to clean the ballroom. He entered the grand space, now empty except for scattered napkins and the lingering scent of roses. The chandeliers had been dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. And there, in the corner, sat the piano. Thomas approached it slowly, almost reverently. His cleaning cart remained by the door, forgotten. He had made a decision, one that frightened and excited him in equal measure. Tomorrow he would do something that would change everything. Tomorrow he would find the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light. But tonight, in the privacy of the empty ballroom, he would practice. He would remember who he had been and prepare for who he might become again. His fingers found the keys, and the first notes filled the silence like a promise waiting to be kept. Margaret arrived at the academy library the next morning with a spring in her step. She always volunteered on Saturdays, helping to organize the children's reading program and assist with research projects. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting warm golden rectangles across the wooden floors. She was still thinking about the previous evening. The gala had been beautiful, but something about that silent piano kept nagging at her. It seemed wrong somehow, like a bird that had forgotten how to sing. "Good morning, dear," called Mrs. Patterson from behind the circulation desk. "How are you feeling after last night? I hope you didn't stay up too late celebrating." "Oh, I'm fine," Margaret replied, hanging her coat on the wooden rack near the entrance. "Though I have to admit I kept thinking about that poor piano sitting there unused." Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically. "I know exactly what you mean. I've been trying to think of solutions all morning. Perhaps we could contact the music department at the university." Margaret was about to respond when she noticed someone approaching the front desk. It was a man she had never seen before, though something about him seemed vaguely familiar. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he had tried to tame it but hadn't quite succeeded. His clothes were clean but simple, work pants and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. What struck her most were his hands. They were working hands with calluses and small scars that spoke of physical labor, but they moved with a strange grace as he nervously adjusted his shirt collar. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "I'm looking for Miss Sinclair." Margaret felt a flutter of surprise. "That's me. How can I help you?" The man took a deep breath, and she could see him gathering his courage. "My name is Thomas Wheeler. I work here at the academy as the night janitor." Now she remembered where she had seen him. She had passed him in the hallways a few times during her volunteer work, always pushing a cleaning cart or carrying supplies. He had always nodded politely but never spoken. "I was working during the gala last night," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about the piano." Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm as she remembered her playful comment about marrying whoever could play it. Several other volunteers had gathered around the desk, curious about this unusual conversation. "Oh," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "I hope you don't think I was being serious about that. I was just being silly." Thomas looked directly at her then, and she was surprised by the intensity in his dark eyes. "Actually, Miss Sinclair, I was hoping you meant it, because I'd like to take you up on your offer." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. Mrs. Patterson's mouth had fallen open slightly, and she could hear someone whisper, "Did he just—" "I'm sorry," Margaret said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand what you're saying." Thomas straightened his shoulders, and she could see the determination building in his expression. "You said you would marry anyone who could make that piano sing. I'm here to tell you that I can do exactly that." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt a dozen different emotions swirling through her mind: shock, confusion, disbelief, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Mr. Wheeler," Mrs. Patterson interjected gently, "I think perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Sinclair was speaking hypothetically last evening." "I know she was," Thomas replied, never taking his eyes off Margaret. "But hypothetical or not, she recognized something important. That piano deserves to be played by someone who understands its value, someone who can bring it to life the way it was meant to be. Margaret found her voice again, though it came out smaller than she intended. You're saying you can play piano? I'm saying I can make that instrument do things that would surprise everyone in this room. There was no arrogance in his statement, just quiet confidence. Margaret studied his face, looking for signs that this was some kind of joke, but his expression was completely serious. Mr. Wheeler, she said slowly, I appreciate your interest, but surely you understand that my comment last night was not a genuine proposal of marriage. It was just a figure of speech. I understand that, Thomas said. But I also heard something else in your voice. You weren't just talking about finding someone to play music. You were talking about finding someone who could see the beauty in something others had overlooked. Someone who wouldn't be afraid to step forward when others stepped back. His words sent a shiver through her. How had this stranger understood so much from a casual comment? Even if that were true, Margaret said, her mind racing. What you're suggesting is impossible. You don't know anything about me, and I don't know anything about you. I know you volunteer here every Saturday because you believe education should be available to everyone, Thomas said. I know you stay late to help students with their research projects, even when the library is officially closed. I know you bring books from your personal collection when you think a student would benefit from reading them. Margaret stared at him in amazement. How could you possibly know all that? Because I've been working in this building for 3 years. I see the lights you leave on, the notes you write to remind yourself to help certain students. I see the kindness you show when you think no one is watching. Mrs. Patterson was looking back and forth between them like she was watching a tennis match. The other volunteers had moved closer, not wanting to miss a word of this extraordinary conversation. Mr. Wheeler, Margaret said, struggling to process what was happening. Even if everything you're saying is true, what you're proposing is completely unrealistic. We're from different worlds, different social circles. My family would never, your family would never accept someone like me. Thomas finished for her. I know that. But yesterday evening you didn't talk about social circles or family expectations. You talked about finding someone special enough to make that piano sing. Margaret felt trapped between two worlds. Part of her wanted to end this conversation immediately, to politely explain that his proposal was impossible and send him on his way. But another part of her was intensely curious. Could this quiet janitor really play piano? And if so, how well? Suppose, she said carefully, just suppose I were to believe that you can play. What exactly are you proposing? Thomas took another deep breath. I'm proposing that you give me a chance to prove myself. One evening, just you and whatever witnesses you'd like to bring. Let me show you what that piano can do in the right hands. If I fail to impress you, I'll never mention this conversation again. And if you succeed? If I succeed, Thomas said, his voice steady and sure. Then we talk about what comes next. Margaret looked around the room at the faces watching her. Mrs. Patterson looked fascinated despite her obvious shock. The other volunteers seemed to be holding their breath. This was the most ridiculous situation she had ever found herself in. A janitor was essentially challenging her to honor a throwaway comment about marriage, based on his claimed ability to play piano. It was like something out of a storybook. But wasn't that exactly what she had wished for the night before? Something magical and unexpected? When? She heard herself ask. Thomas smiled for the first time since approaching her, and it transformed his entire face. Tonight, after the building closes. Just you, me, and that piano. Margaret paced nervously in her bedroom, glancing at the clock every few minutes. 7:30. She had 30 minutes before she was supposed to meet Thomas at the academy. Part of her couldn't believe she had agreed to this crazy arrangement. She had spent the entire day questioning her decision. Her friend Helen had called that afternoon, and when Margaret explained what had happened, Helen's reaction was exactly what she expected. Are you completely out of your mind? Helen had practically shouted through the phone. You're going to meet a strange man alone in an empty building because he claims he can play piano? Mrs. Patterson will be there, Margaret had defended weakly. And the security guard. It's not like we'll be completely alone. Margaret, think about what you're doing. This man is a janitor. Even if he can play a few simple songs, what then? You can't seriously be considering anything beyond that. But that was exactly what Margaret couldn't get out of her head. What if Thomas could really play? What if he was extraordinary? What would that mean for both of them? She had tried to push the thoughts away all day, but they kept returning. There was something about the way he had spoken to her, the quiet confidence in his voice that made her believe he wasn't making empty promises. Margaret checked her reflection one more time. She had chosen a simple green dress, nothing too fancy, but appropriate for the occasion. Her hands were trembling slightly as she picked up her purse and car keys. The drive to the academy felt both too long and too short. When she pulled into the parking lot, she saw Mrs. Patterson's car already there, along with a few others she didn't recognize. Apparently, word had spread about tonight's unusual audition. Mrs. Patterson met her at the front entrance, looking both excited and worried. "Margaret, dear, are you sure about this? It's not too late to change your mind." "I know," Margaret replied, surprised by her own determination. "But I need to see this through. I need to know if he was telling the truth." They walked through the dimly lit hallways toward the ballroom. Margaret could hear voices ahead, quiet conversation that stopped as they approached the doors. Inside the ballroom, she was surprised to see about a dozen people gathered. There was Dr. Williams from the gala, 2 teachers from the academy, the security guard, and several other staff members she recognized. Apparently, news of Thomas's challenge had created quite a stir. Thomas was standing near the piano, looking more nervous than he had that morning. He had changed into what appeared to be his best clothes, a dark suit that was a bit worn but clean and well pressed. When he saw Margaret enter, he straightened up and nodded respectfully. "Miss Sinclair," he said, "thank you for coming." "Mr. Wheeler?" she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. There are witnesses here who will remember this evening for a very long time." "I'm counting on it," Thomas said simply. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward to address the small crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. As you know, Mr. Wheeler has made some rather extraordinary claims about his musical abilities. We're here to give him the opportunity to demonstrate those skills." Margaret found herself a seat in the front row, her heart pounding. She noticed that everyone else seemed just as tense as she felt. This was either going to be a beautiful surprise or a terrible embarrassment for everyone involved. Thomas approached the piano bench and sat down slowly. For a moment, he just sat there with his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed. Margaret could see him taking deep breaths, preparing himself for what was to come. When he finally placed his hands on the keys, the transformation was immediate and startling. The moment his fingers touched the piano, it was as if he became a completely different person. His nervousness disappeared, replaced by a calm confidence that filled the entire room. The first notes that emerged were soft and hesitant, like someone testing the waters of a familiar lake. But within seconds, the music began to build and flow, with increasing complexity and beauty. Margaret recognized the piece. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of her favorite classical compositions. But this wasn't just someone playing notes on a page. This was music being brought to life by someone who understood every nuance, every emotion the composer had intended to convey. Thomas's hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who worked with mops and cleaning supplies. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. The sound filling the ballroom was absolutely magnificent. The piano, which had sat silent for months, was singing with a voice more beautiful than she had ever heard. She glanced around the room and saw the same amazement reflected on every face. As the Chopin piece came to its gentle conclusion, Thomas transitioned seamlessly into something completely different. Jazz notes began to pour from the piano, complex rhythms and improvised melodies that showcased not just technical skill, but genuine creativity. His left hand established a steady bass line while his right hand danced across the higher keys, creating music that was both sophisticated and deeply emotional. Margaret found herself leaning forward in her chair, completely captivated. This wasn't just good piano playing. This was artistry at the highest level. She had attended concerts by professional musicians who couldn't match what she was hearing right now. The jazz piece evolved into a classical composition she didn't recognize, something that seemed to blend different musical traditions into something entirely new. Thomas's face was completely focused, lost in the music he was creating. His earlier nervousness had vanished entirely, replaced by pure joy and concentration. For 20 minutes he played without stopping, moving from one piece to another with the confidence of someone who had been performing his entire life. Classical masterpieces flowed into modern compositions, then into pieces that seemed to be his own creation. Each transition was smooth and natural, as if he was telling a story through music. Margaret realized she was crying. The beauty of what she was hearing had overwhelmed her completely. Around the room, she could see similar reactions on other faces. Dr. Williams was shaking his head in amazement. Mrs. Patterson had tears streaming down her cheeks. Finally, Thomas brought his performance to a close with a gentle, haunting melody that seemed to wrap around everyone in the room like a warm embrace. The last notes hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the building's heating system. Thomas slowly lifted his hands from the keys and turned to face his audience. His expression was vulnerable now, waiting for their reaction. He looked directly at Margaret, and she could see everything he was feeling reflected in his eyes: hope, fear, and a quiet pride in what he had just shared. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked toward the piano, toward this man who had just revealed a gift so extraordinary that it had left her speechless. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How is this possible?" Thomas looked down at his hands, then back at her. "Music was my first language," he said quietly. Everything else came after. Margaret realized that her entire world had just shifted. Nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret stared at Thomas in the quiet ballroom, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The silence felt heavy with possibility and uncertainty. Around them, the small audience began to stir, whispers of amazement filling the air. "That was incredible," Dr. Williams said, stepping forward. "Young man, where did you study? Juilliard? The conservatory?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I never finished my formal training. Life got in the way." Mrs. Patterson approached them with tears still glistening in her eyes. "Mr. Wheeler, I owe you an apology. I had no idea we had such talent working right here in our building. This is extraordinary." Margaret felt like she was watching everything happen from a distance. Her playful comment from the night before had led to this moment, but she had never imagined anything like what she had just witnessed. The man standing before her wasn't just talented. He was gifted in a way that defied explanation. "I need some air," she said quietly, walking toward the ballroom doors. Outside in the hallway, Margaret leaned against the wall and tried to collect her thoughts. Everything she believed about her world, about the neat categories people fit into, had been completely shaken. How had someone with such extraordinary talent ended up cleaning floors in the building where she volunteered? Thomas appeared in the doorway, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Miss Sinclair, are you all right?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I don't know anything anymore." He stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. "I'm sorry if I upset you. I know this whole situation is strange." Margaret looked at him carefully. In the dim hallway light, she could see the worry in his expression. "Tell me your story, Thomas. The real story. How does someone who plays like that end up working as a janitor?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "My father died when I was 17. There were debts, and my mother needed help supporting the family. I had been accepted to the state conservatory with a partial scholarship, but it wasn't enough to cover everything, so I went to work instead." "What about after that? You could have gone back to music later?" "I tried for a while," Thomas said. I played at small clubs and restaurants on weekends, but it barely paid anything. When my mother got sick, I needed steady work with health benefits. The night shift here paid better than most jobs I could get without a degree. Margaret felt a deep sadness wash over her. So you gave up your dreams? I thought I had, Thomas replied. But music never really leaves you. Late at night, when the building was empty, I would sometimes play that piano. It was the only time I felt like myself again. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Margaret was beginning to understand the courage it had taken for Thomas to approach her that morning. He had risked everything, his job, his dignity, his carefully guarded privacy, for the chance to be seen as more than just the invisible night janitor. Thomas, she said carefully, what happens now? Even if I wanted to honor what I said last night, you know it's not that simple. My family, my social circle, they would never understand. I know, Thomas said. I've thought about that all day. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Margaret. I'm asking you to get to know me, to see if there's something real between us beyond a moment of beautiful music. The way he said her name sent a flutter through her chest. No one had ever spoken to her with such gentle honesty. It would be scandal, she said. My father would be furious. People would talk. People always talk, Thomas replied. The question is whether you care more about what they say or about what might be possible between us. Margaret studied his face in the hallway light. There was something about him that drew her in, not just his talent, but his quiet strength, and the way he seemed to see her as more than just a wealthy volunteer playing at charity work. I need time to think, she said. Of course. I understand. They returned to the ballroom where the small crowd was still buzzing with excitement about the performance. Several people approached Thomas to ask more questions about his background and training. Margaret watched him handle the attention with grace and humility, never boasting about his abilities or making excuses for his current circumstances. Dr. Williams was particularly enthusiastic. Mr. Wheeler, I have connections at the university, music department. With your talent, I'm sure we could arrange for you to complete your formal training. That's very kind, Thomas replied, but I'm not sure that's the path for me anymore. Margaret felt a surge of admiration for his response. He wasn't trying to use his newfound recognition to escape his current life. He seemed genuinely content with who he had become, even while acknowledging what might have been. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Mrs. Patterson pulled Margaret aside. My dear, I hope you'll think carefully about whatever decision you're facing. That young man is special in ways that go far beyond his musical abilities. What do you mean? I mean, he's been quietly helping our struggling students for months. He sees which children stay late because they don't want to go home, and he makes sure they have snacks and a safe place to study. He fixes broken equipment without being asked and never expects credit for it. Character like that is rare, Margaret. Margaret felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. Thomas wasn't just a talented musician trapped in the wrong job. He was someone who found ways to make a difference wherever he was, regardless of his circumstances. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. She began staying later at the academy during her volunteer shifts, often finding excuses to be there when Thomas arrived for work. They talked about books, about music, about their dreams and fears. She learned that he read voraciously, borrowing books from the academy library during his breaks. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with insights that often surprised her. When she mentioned struggling with a particularly difficult student in the reading program, Thomas suggested an approach that worked beautifully. Slowly, carefully, they began to trust each other. Thomas shared stories about his childhood, about the mother who had sacrificed so much to give him music lessons. Margaret talked about the pressure she felt to live up to her family's expectations, about feeling like she was playing a role that didn't quite fit. One evening, 6 months after that first performance, Thomas approached her with a small velvet box. Margaret, I know this is complicated. I know your family will be angry and people will gossip. But I also know that what we have is real and rare and worth fighting for. Margaret looked at the simple ring he offered, then at the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. Yes, she said simply. A year later, Margaret Wheeler walked down the aisle of a small church to music played by her husband. The wedding was smaller than her family had originally planned, but it was filled with people who understood that love sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Thomas eventually became the Academy's music director, bringing the same quiet excellence to teaching that he had brought to everything else in his life. Their story became local legend, proof that promises made from the heart should always be kept, even when they're made in jest, and the piano in the Academy ballroom never stayed silent again.